Okay. Phone. At least it's got a battery in it that works. Okay. What are you doing here? The sheriff asked. It's good to see you too, Kurt. Mark smiled. I'm sorry. How are you? Fine, thanks. We were driving by when we heard the shooting. We stopped and were watching from the top of the hill. Mark pointed behind him. I was trying to figure out what was going on when we heard you coming. So what's going on? That's what I'm trying to figure out. The four here say that they were walking by and saw the garden. They claim they called to the house, but no one answered, so they helped themselves to some of the produce. Then someone started shooting at them. They said they tried to leave, but the people in the house kept them pinned down, and they couldn't make it back to the road. This is Jack Calvert's place, and he's kind of a hothead, so I don't doubt the kids are telling the truth. Mark looked over at the quartet and noticed that they were very young. Where did they come from? I haven't asked them yet. Come with me while I finish questioning them, Kurt said. The four young people told Kurt they were from San Antonio and had escaped from the airport shelter about a week ago. None of them had ever met before their internment in the camp. All of them were single and had their own apartments on the north side of town. They didn't know the status of their families and could get no help in determining the condition of their loved ones from the shelter staff. They decided to band together, escape, and see if they could find out about their parents and siblings. Two of them had families in San Antonio. One of the houses was burned, and there was no sign of the girl's mother and father. It was possible that they hadn't escaped the burned-out neighborhood. The other house had obviously been attacked, and the young man's family had been murdered. The house had been ransacked, but the murdering thieves hadn't found his .22 rifle or the .38 special revolver that were hidden in his old room. One of the families lived in Minnesota, and it was way too far to try to reach their house. The last family lived southwest of Houston in the suburbs, so they decided to try to make it there. The sheriff went to the house to talk to the residents and get their side of the story. Mark could not hear what Kurt was asking, but he could hear Mr. Calvert's answers. He was hollering about how he was sick and tired of people just helping themselves to his garden produce, and about how someone had even stolen a couple of horses last week. He even yelled at the sheriff for not doing enough. Only when I take matters into my own hands do you show up, Calvert barked. Mark had stayed with the refugees, and he was glad he did. He didn't know if he could be as patient as Kurt was with this irate homeowner. The vegetable thieves, quote-unquote, were all young and strong. It was a good thing they were, Mark thought. Only the strongest would be able to make a journey as far as they planned. It would be hard on them still, but it would be almost impossible for a typical middle-aged person to hike that far. Mark looked at the gear the young people had. It was inadequate for even a backyard campout, let alone a trip of the magnitude they were attempting. They had no tent, just blankets to sleep on, a few pots, fewer clean clothes, almost no food, and cheap backpacks to carry it all in. Mark felt sorry for them, but there wasn't much he could do. He asked them what they did before the burst, but none of them had any skills that were needed in Silver Hills. 3 of them were college students, and one was a telemarketer. They looked scared and hungry. Mark made up his mind that he had to help them somehow if he could. The sheriff spoke a few more minutes with Mr. Calvert and then came back over to Mark. Darn fool, he exclaimed. If he would have just fired a couple of warning shots, the kids would have run off. But no, he was going to get even with these kids for all the wrong that's been done to him since the burst. I told him that if he had answered them when they called to the house, they probably would have gone away. He's as much to blame in my book as these kids are. What are you going to do with them? Mark asked, tipping his head toward the 4 scared youths. Let them go. The sheriff shrugged his wide shoulders. I don't have room in the jail for them, even if I wanted to take them in. They're almost out of the county anyway, and then they won't be our problem. Why? I was thinking of taking them to Silver Hills. What for? The sheriff asked. Just to let them clean up and maybe give them some food and gear to help them make it. Going to be a good Samaritan, huh? Not really. I just feel bad for them. Tomorrow I'll take them to Gonzales. That'll get them a little closer to their destination, Mark explained. I need a favor from you, though. Name it, but first you have to tell me what you're doing out here. Mark explained how they had dropped Craig and Connie off in Gonzales, and the circumstances that brought that to pass. Mark asked the sheriff how he knew about the little shootout, and the lawman told him one of the residents up the road had one of his radios, just like Silver Hills did. Mark then asked Kurt if he would drop George off to look at the Promise Point gardens with Greg and Rob. Kurt agreed, and then he told the 4 travelers that he was going to let them go. They thanked him profusely. He told them they could thank him by not trespassing anymore. They assured him that they wouldn't. Kurt then explained that Mark had volunteered to take them back to his house to clean up and rest, and then he would take them to Gonzales in the morning. If they wanted to take him up on it, he added. If they wanted to take him up on it, he added. The 4 of them jumped at the offer. Mark explained to George that Kurt would take him over to Greg's house, and he would come and pick him up after he got the kids squared away. George left in the squad car, and Mark loaded the kids into the Blazer with David. The trip home was fairly quiet, as the kids seemed to be reflecting on the big bullet they had dodged. Cold coffee. Both literally and figuratively, Mark thought. When they got to the subdivision, Mark found Manny and informed him of what he had in mind, and then put the young people under the grandfather's watch and care. Mark chased David off to school after he made the youth promise to let him tell Jess about the so-called gunfight. No need to get her worked up for nothing, he thought. Then he headed out to pick up George. He thought about the long trip the 4 kids had in front of them, and that naturally made him think about his mother, father, brother, sister, and their families. Mark said a little prayer for them. He also said a prayer for Joe. He had meant to check on him when he got home, but he had been in such a hurry to go and get George that he'd forgotten. He would make sure that was the first thing he did when he got home. He pulled up to the entrance to Promise Point and noticed that they had added some of the big radiator punching spikes to their gate. Greg really had liked that idea. A guard asked him what he wanted, and when he said he was here to pick up George, the guard said that they'd been expecting him and opened the gate. Mark drove to Greg's house, and the Promise Point leader and George were outside talking. Mark parked the Blazer and got out. George had already looked at the gardens and determined the trouble. He had instructed Greg and the others to get some nitrogen and put it in the soil. Greg thanked the farmer for helping and then turned his attention to Mark. Nice bike you gave to Rob. He smiled. He told me that you have several. Any chance we can buy or trade you for another one? I'm sure we could work something out. Mark rubbed his chin and smiled comically. What did you have in mind? What do you need? Greg smiled back mischievously. Lots of stuff, Mark said, as the reality of their situation pressed the joviality out of him. Let me check with my people and get back with you. What do you want it for? We plan to use it for our convoy point vehicle. That's a good idea, Mark said. He then looked at George. Ready to go? The older man nodded his head. Mark shook Greg's hand. Sorry to run, but we have a lot to do. I understand, Greg said, as he finished shaking Mark's hand and then shook George's. Thanks again for your help, George. Maybe you can come back in a couple months and see how our crops are doing? George nodded his head stoically. He and Mark climbed into the Blazer and headed to the hospital in Floresville. Mark noticed that George was staring out of his window without saying anything for a long time. It seemed Greg's invitation to come back in 2 months had struck a nerve. Finally, the farmer turned to Mark and spoke. Do you think I'm doing the right thing, not telling anyone that I'm sick? Mark looked over at the man and could see the pain in his eyes. He thought about the question for a moment before he answered. I don't know if I'm the right person to ask, George. What's right for one person may not be right for another, and I'm no expert on how to best handle things. He paused for a second. I can tell you one thing, though. If it were me, I'd do the same thing you are. Thanks, Mark. George looked like a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He smiled faintly.